Okay, so we've looked at globalizing numbers on inbound SIP trunks on the iOS gateway because we know that the actual protocol for SIP, even though the protocol for ISDN on the TDM leg brings us our type and plan, we know that the SIP protocol doesn't carry any of that information for type and plan onto CUCM. So we had previously looked, and I'll just do a show run pipe to section. Well, let's just do begin with voice translation here on our iOS corporate headquarters SIP gateway, or trunk if you want to call it that. And we had taken voice translation rule 1 and matched no inbound number, so effectively any, but technically no number for all three rules, but we had matched on type subscriber, type national, and type international respectively for the three rules in rule set 1. And for subscriber and national, we had prefixed both a +1. Now, we didn't have any ampersand or /0 because we didn't match on any number, remember? But if we had matched on a number such as dot asterisk or dot plus, both would match everything, then we would have to include the ampersand or /0 after the +1. And then for type international, we prefixed plus. And we translated the types to unknown. We could have left them the same thing, but we translated them not to unknown because it doesn't really matter. The SIP protocol isn't going to carry that. Well, that was just fine to globalize the number we saw. However, in CUCM 8.0 and beyond, we have a new mechanism that we can use to, actually it was in CUCM 7.1 to recall correctly, that we can use to actually globalize these numbers at CUCM rather than at or in an iOS gateway before coming into CUCM. So we're just going to go ahead and get rid of this voice translation rule 1. And just to verify that this is doing what we want, over in our CUCM, we're going to come down to transformation, calling party transformation, and we're going to get rid of our, we've modified this from what you might be used to seeing. And what we've modified this to is essentially saying for US phones, if the call comes from +1, so anywhere in the US, then strip off the +1. So always have 10 digits, whether it's a local subscriber number or whether it's a national number. And then for Netherlands phones, pretty much do the same thing. If it comes from nationally or locally, because all calls will be globalized to that +31 if they're subscriber or national, strip off that +31, and I believe here we prefix a 0 to make it a 10-digit number, beginning with 0 area code or geographic code. But we've left the globalized number to be the globalized number, including plus, for all international numbers to distinguish them and set them apart. So that's how we've modified things already. What we're going to go ahead and do now is just temporarily delete this. You know what? Actually, let's not delete it. Let's just put it in a partition that can't be reached. It doesn't really matter. Let's just choose anything. Let's choose dial national. Okay, so this cannot be reached by the phones who have their calling party transformation CSS set to CSS. They have it set to CSS calling party transformation point corporate headquarter phones or US phones or even branch 1 phones for those two sites respectively. So they can't get to US dial because that CSS for CSS corporate headquarter phones or CSS branch 1 phones does not contain the partition for US dial. So they won't be able to, now I wouldn't leave this here because this could affect other types of calling. In fact, no, it shouldn't cause any other problems because we're just going to do a call in. It would probably be best just to delete this. Let's just go ahead and delete it. Okay, so now we should see all calls into a corporate headquarter phone or branch 1 phone as globalized because we removed the voice translation rule. And notice we didn't even have to remove the voice translation profile or remove the translation rule set from the profile. We can leave that. We can add it in later, and it won't affect anything. It's one of the few nested items in iOS that doesn't require change there. Okay, so let's go ahead and test our call in. So 206.501.1001. And you hear that phone ringing, and in the background here, oops, I haven't set refresh. There we go. Okay, we're still seeing it coming in as 206.501. And the reason we're not seeing it come in as +1 206 is because we removed the globalization, of course, and that is what's coming in from the corporate headquarter gateway. If we scroll up to the actual calling party number, it's 206. Okay? It's kind of maybe a little misleading, or maybe not misleading, but not as descriptive as it might have been, because I removed two things at once. I removed the localization and I removed the globalization. The globalization added the +1. The localization stripped the +1. So what you're seeing on the calling display or called phone display for the calling number is essentially what we were seeing previously as well. So, you know, just to prove that, we could put this, let's just put this back in real briefly. Okay, so if we do this call again, we'll now see this with the +1. Okay, so that was the result of removing the localization. And once we get rid of the no voice translation rule, or do a no voice translation rule to get rid of it, to get rid of the globalization. In fact, let me just remove dial peer debugging so that we're just left with ISDN Q931. Then we will see that our international number will also come in as simply 3120703733. There won't be any +31. Okay? So we've gotten rid of globalization. There is no localization. So we're back to basically a default configuration. Okay, so now what we're going to take a look at is on any trunk, such as a SIP trunk, or on any gateway, we have the ability after 7.1 for the incoming calling party settings to not only have an incoming number, and one of the other differences here, since I'm here, I might as well just go ahead and note, instead of having the ability to have, let's say, you know, plus or +31 as we had previously, and we had :1 to strip the first digit from the left, the least significant digit, before prefixing the plus. That was in 7.0. In 7.1, they actually abstracted that over to the strip digit column. So now we would no longer put the colon in there, but we would simply have strip digits 1. That's if we wanted to do that. Here we're dealing with incoming number. And notice they've also changed the incoming number type from unknown, which is actually a type. Unknown is defined as a type. They've changed it to just incoming number, because they're saying all incoming numbers coming in on a SIP trunk will simply be a incoming number. They don't have a type. They're not really unknown. Whereas if we go over to a gateway such as an ISDN PRI, either H323, or specifically an ISDN PRI or T1 CAS or something like that through MGCP, we have unknown. Okay. So going back, and we'll come back to this because there's more on this page, but going back to our SIP trunk, all incoming numbers are going to be dealt with in a certain prefix? Well, we know from our previous configuration here on our router that we've got, let's just scroll up to the top here. We've got really two different types of prefix, +1, same one, same prefix, and plus to deal with the types of subscriber and international. And if the types aren't coming across, then how are we going to be able to parse them out? Well, one of the things that they've added is the calling search space dropdown. So this lets us use a calling party transformation pattern by use of calling search space and partitions, those construct entities which we know very well by now. And of course, like anything else, we can either use the device pool for this trunk or this device to deal with that for calling party transformation CSS on the device pool, or, and of course, in a larger environment, in a production environment, we certainly would use device pools. I would just make sure that I have a device pool specifically for gateways / other devices, maybe internal devices like MOH servers, but a device pool for gateways at each site and a device pool for phones at each site. I would abstract those two. So I probably would use device pool CSS, but just to keep it a little bit more simple for now, it's not that hard to add that on once you understand the concept. We're going to configure the calling search space here. Now we need to add a calling search space. We have CSSs for called party transformation for gateways. That's for egress. And we've used those here. We even have a calling party transformation CSS. We haven't defined any, but we certainly could. We have some defined here, but those are egress to phones. We could certainly define some here, calling party, corporate headquarter gateway, but we just have to specifically denote in our naming convention at this point, ingress versus egress, because the calling party transformation here is for outbound. Now, I know previously I had said all calling party or called party transformations will occur at the egress. And I said that to, really to try to simplify things. But of course, the more functionality that's needed, the more complex things get. So as Cisco added functionality, the rules that were previously there get stretched or broken. So now there can be calling or called party digit manipulation at either the ingress or egress. So it's really not that difficult. We simply need to make sure that we keep track of our calling search space and partition combo pairs, and that we keep them named intuitively. We keep them separate from each other. And for the most part, we keep only one or possibly one or two partitions per CSS in terms of our digit manipulation CSS and partitions. So for instance, our called party transformation egress, we've got the partition for CD, PTP, corporate headquarter gateway, and we also have the PT or the partition for CD, PTP, US gateways. Both of those are egress, and we would do ourselves a favor to add in this naming convention CSS out, called party transformation, out to all these, out to all these, so that they, or maybe egress so that we know that they're leaving to the phones. Out might infer outbound to the PSTN. So what we're going to do is just that. We're going to rename our CSSs and partitions. And then we're going to add some new CSSs and partitions. So let's call this egress. Or actually, it might make more sense to put that word egress here. Egress to the gateway. Or we might even want to say gateway egress. Yeah, let's just say that. That might make a little more sense. Gateway egress. So we're leaving the gateway. And we're performing digit manipulation as we leave the gateway. And we're going to do the same thing here. So as we're leaving to the phones, we're performing this digit manipulation for a calling party. And you might actually have noticed that I had already created one here. I'm going to go ahead and delete that because I'm going to rename that. So let's now go to our partitions. And let me just delete that in one that I had created there real quickly. We're going to be creating that. So for our called party branch 1 gateway, and of course, in the future, we would name them all appropriately to begin with. And we'll do the same thing for our phones. Just about done here. So I'm changing my calling party transformation for all US phones as it leaves to go to the phone. Okay? And even if we're not going to be doing too much changing on ingress for phones, we still just want to make sure that we label everything in a similar fashion and a similar naming convention. So let's go ahead and add. We're going to add partitions right now for calling party transformation pattern for the ingress. And let's go ahead and add the same, but for called party. And now we're going to go add calling search spaces, one for each of those. And each one is only going to contain, whoops. Each one is only going to contain its respective ingress. So this is the partition for branch 1 ingress for calling for gateways. And I'm just going to copy and make some quick changes. So branch 2, get rid of that one. That's called party gateway ingress for branch 2. I want calling party gateway ingress for branch 2. Copy this. Change that to corporate headquarter for calling at the ingress. And now I'm going to create my called party. That's egress. There's my ingress for called party. Copy this to change the name to branch 1. There's my branch 1 ingress. The names can and letters can kind of run together, so make sure you are very careful and observant that you didn't accidentally get calling for branch 2 at the gateway ingress or called party for branch 2 gateway egress. Just make sure everything is correct. So now let's do contains egress. And there I've got all my egress for gateway and phones. And let's change that to ingress. And now I've got all my ingress for called and calling party for gateway. And we could also do egress calling party for gateway. We talked about why we don't use that too often, but we certainly could. So now back to the SIP trunk, where we can actually populate this calling search space for incoming calling party settings for all incoming numbers. And we can populate this to CNG for corporate headquarter at the ingress. Now this by itself isn't going to do anything, and of course we need to remember to reset the SIP trunk. The trunk doesn't register with CUCM, so it's not going to reset anything on the iOS gateway, but just the subset of the configuration for the CCM process. So that's set. Now we need to actually go populate this calling search space or partition with a pattern. So now let's go to transformation pattern calling party, and we're going to add a new one, specifically in the partition of partition calling party gateway ingress. And the pattern is going to be, we know that if a call comes from a subscriber or national, first of all, we can't just match on type because SIP didn't carry that information across. So what we have to do is the other option we've looked at in iOS, which is what if the carrier doesn't send the information in to even an H323 based iOS gateway or an MGCP based iOS gateway through a T1. We can do this exact same function on an H323 or MGCP gateway under the unknown type if the carrier didn't bring that in. But in the case of SIP trunk, even if the carrier does bring it in, or they didn't, we looked at how we could do this in iOS simply by our human knowledge and pattern matching. So if the carrier is bringing in a subscriber or national number, we know it's going to be 10 digits in the US. That's going to change from country to country, but in the US it's going to be 10 digits. And we know based on the North American numbering plan that the first digit is going to be 2 through 9, then XX, then 2 through 9 XX, and then 4 X's. So this matches all subscriber and national numbers in the US. National numbers in the US don't come in with a 1 like in other countries. The carrier sends in that long distance or national trunk access code. US carriers only send in 10 digits. We may send out a 1, but we're talking about inbound calling number. Okay, so what we want to do is for any 10-digit number, that covers local or subscriber and national. For calling, we simply want to prefix a +1. And I'm going to copy this mainly because the partition's there. For every other number, remember urgent priority is on. It is ticked and you can't untick it. It's grayed out. So this will match all digits. And remember, they're coming in en bloc. So they're coming all at once. And for that, we just want to prefix a plus because the carrier is already sending the country code. We just want to prefix a plus. So let's go back and take a look at our two new patterns. One prefixes a plus and one prefixes a +1 only for corporate headquarter gateway for calling numbers on the ingress. So let's test it and see if everything works. Everything should be globalized because we took out our localization pattern. So let's try this. Let's call in from just the main line. And let's see what we see. There we see our +1, 206, 501. Let's kill this call. And just to be certain, let's just make sure that voice translation rule is not there. Voice translation rule set 9 is the first one that comes in when I did begin with voice translation. So 1 is not there. It's not globalizing on the router. It is globalizing in CUCM. Let's try that from the Amsterdam line. So we should see a +31 now. And in fact, we do. So we'll go ahead and kill this call. So again, what we did was we simply used, for all calls, a CSS. And we could have done that on the device like we did, or we could have done it on the device pool. We just want to make sure that we keep those device pools separate enough that the application of a calling party, and I'll just briefly go to a device pool. Let's say for corporate headquarter gateways and devices. This says under device mobility related, sorry, that's the wrong place. That would actually be the place for egress calling and called party transformation, even for a gateway. Even though it says device mobility related information, it's got those 4 asterisks, and you should go and take a look at what those parameters are. This says it will override device level settings when device is in roaming and the same device mobility group. That's fine. It's not just for device mobility because gateways don't perform device mobility. So it's for a phone when device mobility is enabled, but it can be for a phone when device mobility is not enabled, just for calling party, or for a gateway calling and called party. But this is the egress. For ingress, so incoming calling party and even incoming called. Notice before we only had incoming calling, and we'll talk about called in a moment. Really nothing new other than it translates called numbers, and you should use appropriate ingress called party transformation. Ingress called party for that particular gateway. And we use the same thing. We go to call routing transformation, but instead of going to calling, we go to called. Okay, so we can translate the called number now, just like for all these different types, just like we could translate the calling number previously, okay, for whatever reason, whatever need you might have. So for a SIP gateway where it said, or a SIP trunk where it said use device pool, it would be the unknown number. For all other types, H323 or MGCP, PRI, we specifically have national, international, unknown, or subscriber. For MGCP controlled T1 CAS, we have unknown number. For H323 controlled PRIs or MGCP controlled PRIs, or where the carrier doesn't send any information in regarding type, we can still use unknown number. So this is what we would use for the SIP trunk. But regardless, we simply did it on the actual SIP trunk itself, and we simply said, use this calling search space to find a partition and match a pattern and translate the number or globalize it as it's coming in through the gateway. So that's what happened. And then, of course, we can go back and add a egress to the phone transformation, which is localization for calling party. So let's do calling party for corporate headquarter to the phone's egress, so leaving to go to the phone. And we'll say what we had said before, /1, /+1 dot bang. So strip the plus and the 1 if it's from the US, whether local or national. Strip predot, save. And so now what we've done is simply stripped corporate headquarter calls or branch 1 calls. So if we take a look at an Amsterdam line calling in, it should still say +31. It does still say +31. But if we try that, whoops. If we try that same call from line 1, there we go. Then we should get the phone to show the localized number. So we first globalized it in CUCM, and then we localized it in CUCM. Something that on a SIP trunk, or where the carrier didn't send the type information, we were previously only able to do in iOS.